Good morning. This is Barry Odell with the Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page. It's Tuesday, Tuesday, April 13th, 2021. Glad to see folks joining on this morning. Hey, Brian and Jennifer, Gail and Danny and Connie and Linda. We are ready for Romans chapter 11 in our study today. Romans chapter 11. So we're in this, I guess I would use the term difficult section of the book of Romans. Much of Romans is very fundamental, not hard to understand at all. But Romans chapters 9, 10, and 11 are unique. Hey, Roger and Anita. They are unique indeed, dealing with a very specific topic, addressing the issue between Jews and Gentiles in the Roman church. It was predominantly a Gentile congregation, and I picked that up from Romans chapter 1 and verses 13 and 14. Hello, Sharon from Orlando. So this is an ongoing problem in the first century church between people who had obeyed the gospel who were from a Gentile background and those who had obeyed the gospel who were from a Jewish background. The Jews were jealous. They were prejudiced against everybody, really. I mean, just, go read John chapter 4. Look at the disciples' response to Jesus talking to a Samaritan and a woman. So the church had to deal with this. Paul's desire is that all of Israel might be saved. He starts this section out saying, I wish that I myself could be accursed from Christ for my brethren, according to the flesh. Of course, we know that can't happen. A Christian cannot send themselves to hell so that another person might be saved. It doesn't work like that. He pointed out, as we looked at yesterday, that in Romans chapter 10, that the Jewish people had a zeal for God, which is good, but it was not according to knowledge. Of course, that's not good. And as he went through chapter 10, he pointed out the fact that they had not all obeyed the gospel, verse 16, and that all day God had stretched his hand out to as it says in chapter 10 and verse 21, disobedient and contrary people. And that's a quote from Isaiah chapter 65 and verse 2. So as we open up chapter 11, Paul continues the thought here. And I'll just pull this up here. God did not cast away Israel. Israel rejected God. And so this was apparently the mindset among many of the Jewish people that, the Gentiles are coming in, therefore God has cast us out. That is not true at all. They had been historically and consistently disobedient and contrary. Again, Romans chapter 10 and verse 21. I say then, chapter 11 and verse 1. So this first section here of chapter 11, the first 10 verses, the Old Testament proves that God did not cast away Israel. I say then, has God cast away his people? Certainly not. And then he uses himself as an example. I'm an Israelite, the seed of Abraham, the tribe of Benjamin. God has not cast away his people whom he foreknew. What does that mean, whom God foreknew? You have to go back into chapter 9, and you could read Romans 9 and verses 6 through 13, and notice the details there, the promises that he talks about, the purpose of God that he talks about. God chose Abraham. God chose Isaac. God chose Jacob. And it was through that lineage that eventually Christ would come. God was not wrong for doing that. That was the plan that he chose. God did not cast them away. They had consistently, repeatedly rejected God. So he foreknew that, meaning he chose them, going all the way back again to Abraham. Good morning, Barry and Glenda, and good morning, Diana. Glad to see you guys on here today. So again, the first 10 verses here of Romans chapter 11, the Old Testament proves that God did not cast away his people. So he uses himself, but then he uses Elijah. You remember the prophet Elijah had defeated the prophets of Baal in the days of Ahab and King Ahab and his wife Jezebel. Well, when that happened, Jezebel basically told Elijah, I'm going to have your head. All right, you're going to die. Elijah goes off to himself, and he's mourning, as Paul quotes here in Romans chapter 11, Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. Well, the divine response to that was, listen, I've got 7,000 others who have not bowed the knee to Baal. Elijah was not alone, so he uses himself and he uses Elijah, illustrating the fact that God did not cast Israel away. The problem was that they had constantly rejected him. Again, Romans 10:21, they were disobedient and contrary people, and yet God continued to reach out to them because ultimately it was them, through them, that the Christ came. Galatians 3 is a great discussion on that fact. So that's what we're dealing with here in Romans chapter 11. God did not cast away his people. Even so then, Romans 11:5, at this present time, there is a remnant. At this, right now, he's talking about first century, there is a remnant, okay, a small amount. Not every Jewish person was going to be saved. Being related to Abraham wasn't going to save you. There is a remnant according to the election of grace. Well, what is the election of grace? That was God electing or choosing Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, through whom the Christ would come. That was out of grace that he made that choice. You know, a lot of people, I touched on this, I guess it was last Thursday and then again yesterday, a lot of people use Romans 9, 10, and 11 to say God selects individuals to be saved and individuals to be lost. Okay? Predestination. Calvinism. That's not what this chapter is teaching. In fact, that's not taught anywhere in Scripture. God does not choose individuals to be saved and lost. He chooses the plan, the method by which people will be saved. And if you reject that method, if you reject God's plan, you are one of the lost. So it's according to the election of grace, and if by grace, then it is no longer of works. They didn't, the Jewish people couldn't earn their salvation. Abraham didn't earn God saying, hey, I'm going to choose you and your family. It's not how it works. It's not out of works like that. Otherwise, grace is no longer grace. In other words, they would deserve it. But if it is not, but if it is of works, it is no longer grace. Otherwise, works is no longer works. Nothing that a sinner does, nothing that anybody does, earns them salvation. No, nothing that we do can put God in debt to us for Him to say, "Well, I'm gonna save them because they earned it." That's not how it works. In fact, all of it's out of grace, and we can go back to Genesis chapter 6 and look at Noah. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. So this is what we're dealing with here. The Old Testament proves that God did not cast Israel away. What then? Verse 7, Israel has not obtained what it seeks, but the elect have obtained it, and the rest were blinded, just as it is written. He then quotes Isaiah 29 and Psalm chapter 69, saying that there were some who, as the text says here, God has given them a spirit of stupor. Well, how did God do that? Well, you go back into chapter 9, and it talks about Pharaoh, God hardening Pharaoh. God requiring things of people that they didn't want to do or that they didn't want to believe. And, you know, a verse you could focus on in this section to understand that is Romans chapter 9 and verse 33. Christ is the stumbling block to the Jewish people. They rejected Him. They were, again, disobedient and contrary people, disobedient and contrary to God's plan. They rejected Christ. So he quotes those two passages again here in verses 8 through 10, Isaiah 29 and Psalm 69, proving that it wasn't God who rejected Israel, it was Israel who rejected God's plan. We then go to verses 11 through 18. The Jewish people could still be saved, and the Gentiles didn't need to be arrogant. The language here in the rest of the chapter, I hate to use the word difficult, but I guess I'll use the word difficult. It can be hard to follow. Let me say it that way. I say then, have they stumbled? He's talking about Israel. Have they stumbled that they should fall? Certainly not. In other words, they could still be saved. The Jewish people could still be saved. But through their fall, through the Jewish rejection of the gospel, through their fall, and to provoke them to jealousy, salvation has come to the Gentiles. Now, if their fall is the riches of the world, is riches for the world, and their failure riches for the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? Again, I understand the language is a little bit difficult here in our hearing, perhaps, but the Jewish people rejected Christ. The gospel then went to the Gentiles. Well, the Jews then seeing the Gentiles obeying, Some of them might come back. Some of them might obey, seeing others now obeying the gospel. He says, and then he turns his attention to the Gentile readers. And it's important, one thing that I did here, when you get to verse 13, he says, "For I speak to you Gentiles." And through the rest of this chapter, beginning in verse 16, he uses the word you over and over again, talking to his Gentile readers there in the church at Rome. So just pay attention to that. "I speak to you Gentiles," verse 13, "inasmuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles. I magnify my ministry. If by any means I may provoke to jealousy those who are my flesh," the Jews. "Why? And save some of them." Remember, by and large, the Jewish people rejected the gospel. They rejected Christ. And again, I would refer you, I think I mentioned this passage yesterday, I refer you to Acts 13. You might write this down and read it later. Read Acts 13, 42 to 52, and you'll see this illustrated, what we're reading here in Romans 11. You'll see it illustrated in that passage perfectly. So he wants to save some of them, some of the Jewish people. "For if their being cast away is the reconciling of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead?" They can still be saved if they will turn to God. That's the key. They've got to turn to the gospel. "For if the first fruit is holy, the lump is also holy. And if the root is holy, so are the branches." The first fruit. That word is used a few times in the Bible, Old and New Testament. The first fruit here that's being referred to are those first Jewish people that obeyed the gospel. Well, they're holy. They're God's. The lump is also holy, and the root is holy. So are the branches. Everybody who comes to God is holy, sanctified, set apart. Doesn't matter if you're Jew or Gentile. But notice this, verse 17, some of the branches were broken off. The Jews that rejected Christ, it's like John chapter 15 says, they will be cut down and cast into the fire. They were broken off, and you, Gentiles, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them became a partaker of the root and fatness of the olive tree. Do not boast against the branches. Okay, Gentiles, don't get arrogant. Don't think that you're superior to the Jews. Don't boast against the branches. But if you do boast, remember that you do not support the root, but the root supports you. God is at the source of all of this. The gospel went first to the Jewish people. We understand that. You look at Acts chapter 2, you have 3,000 men of a Jewish background obeying the gospel. They were there in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover feast, or the Feast of Pentecost, as was required of all Jewish males. Read Leviticus chapter 23. So the first fruit are those first Jewish converts to Christianity. They're holy. The Gentiles who have obeyed the gospel, they are holy. If you will come to Christ, he's saying, you can be holy. It doesn't matter who you are or anything like that. But the Gentiles needed to be careful. And again, this was a source of difficulty in that early church because of maybe a good word to use would be animosity. The animosity that existed between the Jewish and Gentile Christians. Don't let that happen. That's his admonition here. He then talks to us in verses 19 through 24 about the goodness and severity of God. You, again, that's a reference to the Gentiles that he's addressing. Looking back up in verse 13. You will say then, branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well said, that's true. The Jews rejected it. The gospel went to the Gentiles. That's true. Because of unbelief they were broken off, and you stand by faith. Do not be haughty, but fear, for if God did not spare the natural branches, he may not spare you either. And here's why. Consider the goodness and severity of God. On those who fell, severity. They were broken off. But towards you, goodness, if you continue in his goodness, otherwise you also will be cut off. That's just the key. The Jewish people did not, again, by and large, did not continue in the goodness of God. They rejected Christ. They rejected the gospel. So his warning here is to the Gentiles. Don't do that. You can be broken off just as easily as the Jews were. And they also, if they do not continue in unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. The Jewish people can be saved, but they've got to come to him. They've got to come to Christ. For if you were cut off out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted in contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these who are by nature, who are natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? He's using an agricultural illustration, this olive tree, just telling the Gentiles, the Jews who at one time rejected Christ can still come back to him. And if you reject Christ, or if you become arrogant against the Jews, you'll be cut off. All right? That's the goodness and severity of God. And whether we face God's goodness or severity is wholly dependent upon how we, contextually here, how we treat each other within the church. All right, verses 25 to 32, Jews and Gentiles are saved in the same way, and that is by the deliverer. Okay? For I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinion, that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. This is the mystery. Okay, this is mentioned several times in your New Testament. Paul talks about it again in Ephesians chapter 3. And in fact, there in Ephesians chapter 3, he's writing to Gentiles there too. He's very specific. The mystery was, how would God, who is the God of the Jews historically, how would he accept the Gentiles in association with the Jews? Well, it was through Christ. Remember, Ephesians 2 says that God broke down that middle wall of partition when Christ died on the cross. That source of enmity was done away with, and the Jews and Gentiles are now one body in Christ. And so that's what we're dealing with here. And then he says this, and so all Israel will be saved. Now I want you to read that again. Look at that, verse 26. And so all Israel will be saved. Some people say, well, one day all Jewish people are going to be saved. And that's not what Paul's talking about. So is an adverb of manner. In other words, in the same way, in the same manner, all Israel will be saved. Well, how is that going to happen? As it is written, the deliverer will come out of Zion, and he will turn away ungodliness from Jacob, for this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. The point being here, if the Jews are going to be saved, it's just like the Gentiles are. If the Gentiles are going to be saved, it's just like the Jews are. It's through Christ, through the deliverer, as he's called here. Concerning the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. But concerning the election, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. Concerning the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. Well, again, if you reject God and if you reject the gospel, you're certainly an enemy. There's no question about that. But concerning the election, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. The promises from the Old Testament, the prophecies that tell us both Jews and Gentiles one day would be together in one body. The Jewish people really struggled with that. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable, for as you were once disobedient to God, yet have now obtained mercy through their disobedience. The Gentiles were privileged to hear the gospel. You know, we think of Cornelius, Acts chapter 10, the first Gentile convert to Christianity. They were privileged to hear the gospel when the Jews rejected it and turned away. And as Paul says there in Acts 13, who judged them, they judged themselves unworthy of everlasting life. Well, now everybody can obtain mercy, Jew and Gentile. Verse 32, for God has committed them all to disobedience that he might have mercy on all. That's exactly what Paul said way back in Romans chapter 3 and verse 9. What then? Are we better than they? No, not at all. For we have previously charged both Jews and Gentiles that they are all under sin. So he's making this exact same point here in Romans chapter 11. And he's also making the point, since they are all under sin, they've all got to be saved in the same way. And that's by the deliverer. So then we end there with verse 32 in this section. God has mercy on all. And that mercy is available through Jesus Christ. And then verses 33 through 36, he says, oh, the depth and the riches, after he's considered everything in here in chapters 9, 10, and 11. Here's his conclusion. God has not cast away the Jewish people. They can still be saved. But their having rejected the gospel opened the door for the Gentiles to hear the gospel. Now you have the church that's made up of former Jews and Gentiles. And now perhaps more Jewish people will come in, since they now understand this. This mystery has been revealed. And so, oh, the depth and the riches both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out. In other words, who would ever have designed a plan of salvation like this? Who would ever have thought to save people in this way, where some might hear it and believe it, others reject it, and when they reject it, it opens the door to others that would then open the door to others. This was God's plan. This was God's mystery. Talked about in the Old Testament, prophesied in the Old Testament many times, but then finally fully revealed in Christ. Everybody's saved in the same way. And then once again he quotes the Old Testament, for who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has become his counselor, or who has first given to him, and it shall be repaid to him. Time after time, when Paul's writing, in all of his writings, not just here in the book of Romans, but he goes back to the Old Testament scriptures to verify the point that he's making. Nobody's as smart as God. Nobody would have thought up a plan of salvation, a plan of redemption like God did, and then have it work as it worked perfectly, just as he designed it. For of him and through him and to him are all things, to whom be glory forever. Amen. Talking about, again, God's unsearchable ways. All right, guys, that's Romans chapter 11. And like I said, I understand the language can be a little, maybe intimidating. Maybe that's a good way to say it. Read it slowly, keep it in its context, understand what he's talking about, starting back in chapter 9 and verse 1, that Paul would have all of his Jewish brethren to be saved. But his point in this section in chapters 9, 10, and 11 is, if the Jews are going to be saved, they've got to come to Christ. If the Gentiles are going to be saved, they've got to come to Christ. They're all saved in the same way, and they're all put into one body, which is the church. That's Romans chapters 9, 10, and 11. That's what I've got for today, guys. I appreciate you joining on here. I don't see any questions or comments here in the comment section. Just a lot of greetings. Glad to have you all on here today. If you do have any questions or comments after the stream is over, you can still access the comment section. The plan will be to come back tomorrow, Lord willing, at 11 o'clock, and we'll start on Romans 12. The rest of this book, 12 through 16, very fundamental. Very, I guess I would say down to earth. I mean, everyday Christianity. That's a good way I'd put it. So we'll pick up there tomorrow, Romans chapter 12. Thank you, Diana. I appreciate that. Linda, glad you were on here. Lyle, good to see you. All right, guys, have a good day, and I hope to see you back here tomorrow at 11 o'clock, and we will pick up in Romans chapter 12. Have a good day.